Right, this is Laser Economics. Laser Economics. I'm giving you young Bob that, money doesn't come from gold smuggled into the UAE. It actually comes from this. So that's a quick dig at this young Bob, who should be renamed Young Knob because he doesn't know his stuff. He was asked a question, what is conservatism? And I will answer that in this video. So let me explain economics to you. And if Rachel Reeves is listening, honestly, with all the annoying things about Rachel Reeves, it's just her annoying southern sort of home counties Labour accent. So economics is about this in a nutshell. There are three resources. Now, of course, all you Ofsted people are going to be going, there's four. No, there's not. There's only three. Now, it is our natural resources, our land, our oil. We have oil in the North Sea that we can basically pull out of the North Sea and heat our homes with. But of course, because of net zero, we can't. We're paying Norway to sell us gas so that we can charge high energy prices. You can't make this up. We have our labour resources. Now, we have record number of people, 9 million, who are receiving state benefits. Our welfare system is out of control. The resources of your country are your labour resources. And that's why this channel is pro-immigration, just not pro-invasion. I'll come to that in a minute. And then you have your man-made resources. Now, the word man applies to men and women. I'm not wasting my pen by basically going over that. And that is your machinery. Now, in some textbooks, you'll see that technology is a factor. And in most textbooks, you'll see that enterprise is a factor. But enterprise basically allocates these three resources because every single country has got to answer three questions: what to produce, how to produce it, and for who. Any economics textbook or any good economics textbook will tell you that. So these are the three resources. These are those three. These two are resources, and I believe in some countries they teach that there are five. Fine. But these are our basic resources. So then you go along to the great documentary made by it was actually PBS. Got a couple of notes here. So, history lesson of economics. From around 1800 onwards, you had the Industrial Revolution. Yeah? I've got a spelling error there. But the Industrial Revolution became like this. Because up to this time, people had never heard of socialism. People had never heard of the Communist Manifesto. But of course, in 1789, the French decided to destroy their nobility. That's why France to this day is a basket case country. Yeah, sorry for anyone French watching, but like I say, the French are basket cases because they got rid of their aristocracy. So then the economic problem, and the father of economics, Adam Smith, spoke about how nations became wealthy. Now, I'm going to take a big jump here, because in 1848, there were riots across Europe, and you had someone called Karl Marx. Now, he is the honorary vice president of all British universities, because we teach communism now. Because Marx came out with the Commie Manifesto and Das Kapital. And what Marx proposed was that this system of perfect capitalism was no good. Now, let me explain what perfect capitalism is and what happened in Great Britain during the Industrial Revolution. We had little to no government. It was only Peel, I think in in the Napoleonic Wars, it was only during the Napoleonic Wars that the British government introduced income tax. Then innovation and private enterprise creates growth. So that is actually the mantra of the Conservative Party, because the Conservative Party seeks the system. It seeks the invisible hand. It seeks the fact that growth is determined by private enterprise doing well. And also, the problem with Marx is that he started to say that labour should seize the means of production. That's what he talked about. So then we go to these guys. This is perfect communism. This is the system taught in our universities. This is why there's only a very few people who actually have escaped this system. You've here got perfect communism. And it was a great shock to the world when the USSR was formed, because you can read about your history. But this is economics. So Lenin became the first dictator of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And initially it went really badly. And he got to the stage where he had to introduce the new economic plan. Now, the new economic plan, you were allowed to have small businesses, but he retained control of the commanding heights of the economy, which is that heavy industry was controlled by the state, oil and gas was controlled by the state, manufacturing was controlled by the state. So the new economic plan was only a slight variation on the system of communism. Then, at the same time, the success story of the 1920s was the good old US of A, which to this day is the beacon of free enterprise. So in the USA, you had the radio was invented, you had the automobile was being mass-produced by Henry Ford, of all people, fix or repair daily, Ford, any colour as long as it's black. And the USA was the star performer of the 1920s. But then what happened in 1929 was you had the crash. And sadly, that led to the USA introducing Roosevelt. Now, Roosevelt came up with the new economic deal. They built dams. The state intervened to sort out the unemployment. Enter, where's he gone? One of the most interesting people in economics, and that's this guy. He liked to fag, did old Keynes, but this was John Maynard Keynes. Now, he was the one who correctly predicted that the Versailles Treaty would cause a second war, which it did. In fact, even one of the French generals said that that would cause a war. But he introduced the idea of Keynesian economics. Now, Keynesian economics kind of sits in the middle. And this is where people who say they are centrist, in reality, there is no such thing as centrist. But Keynes became known as the savior of capitalism. Because the problem with your capitalist system is that you create recessions. Now, recessions are actually quite a good thing in the market system, because in a recession, an inefficient business is closed. Because if you don't produce cars correctly, if you don't manufacture goods correctly, the purpose of a recession, and thanks to Tony Blair, the biggest, I'm keeping this clean, the biggest idiot he wasn't an idiot, he completely destroyed Britain and basically set us on a path to communism by stealth. And that's why Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer are basically just communists. There is no centre ground. You are either aspiring to communism or you are aspiring to capitalism. And so then came along the between the wars mess. On one hand, you had communism. Now, communism until 1930 didn't really go too well. You could read about this factually in your history books. But then came the problem. Germany. Now, Germany up until 1929 was rebuilding, but Germany was hit by the Great Depression. And in your Ofsted lesson, you've got to learn all this shit. And basically, essentially, the reason why Hitler was essentially elected into power is that he said, Hitler said, I'm a capitalist. But in reality, Hitler was a socialist. Now, he wasn't a socialist in the same vein as Lenin and Trotsky. Got an ice pick, I know that from the song. And essentially, the NDA, what was the actual name of the, he formed, I'll do it in English, the National Socialist Party of Germany. So he was a liar. Now, toss up, who's worse, Tony Blair or Hitler? Come back to you on that one. Because he aspired to this, but in reality, he did this. And so, essentially, there was a problem. Now, let's go back to Great Britain. Now, ironically, Britain saved itself with better planes and radar. How did those things come about? They came about through perfect capitalism. So the perfect capitalism was that the British government paid private business and also worked with private business to produce radar, to produce the Spitfire, and to produce the Lancaster, which were superior. And for all of those Tommy Robinson fans who want to actually basically sing 10 German bombers, well, the 10 German bombers were not as good as the British ones. But the RAF from England shot them down. So that's a quick. And the reason why they shot them down is because Germany lurched to socialism. And I can back that up because essentially many German businesses were state-controlled. Germany essentially had state-funded road-building programs, which incidentally all led out the country. So basically, when Hitler launched his blitzkrieg on Poland and launched his blitzkrieg on France, he already had the infrastructure to send supplies into France. We all know what happened. Then you had the Great War between Germany and the USSR. And if it wasn't for the fact that there was the Triple Alliance in the Second World War, Britain, USA and USSR, then these guys would have won. I mean, can you imagine Hitler with a nuclear bomb? This is the Hitler who was hosting the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. You can actually get done in England for having a picture of the two. So that is economic systems. The USA was a broadly capitalist country. No government healthcare. There was some funding for education, but it was a limited government. Low taxes, low government spending. That's what conservatism is. It is primarily an economic doctrine, and this is where this lady comes in. This lady challenged the 1945 orthodoxy. Well, let's see what happened in England, because we won the war and then lost the peace. Because Germany got defeated. Thank God. Probably the last knockings. Probably the last time the great Antichrist, sorry, Maggie, the great Antichrist of Nazi Germany was defeated. But then Great Britain was sat around here. In fact, actually, I would say that during the 1930s, Britain was a more capitalist country than the USA, because the USA had Roosevelt's New Deal, the New Deal. So we were actually over here. And then you had the famous 1945 election. And this is why in my office I do not have Churchill up. Sorry, Tommy Robinson supporters, the only Prime Minister I can actually think of who I can even, put on the wall that I'm proud of is Margaret Thatcher. Now, unfortunately, our current Prime Minister, I'm bad with camera work, care is by the bin. So anyway, let's get back to the great 1945 election. Churchill was a good rebel-rousing guy. He's not very popular in Asia, by the way. He was also a complete racist. But he was a good World War time leader. And he decided that in the national interest that there should be a national government during the war. So there were socialists and capitalists working together to defeat Hitler. And by and large, it worked. Now, I think his greatest mistake was calling an election so early. The war was not over. He should have allowed the servicemen to come home. But I think that Churchill, on balance, was a good person. I don't think he deliberately did what was going on in Asia, and we don't talk about that. But basically, suddenly Britain, and this is what we always do, we had a 1945 election, and that was capitalism versus communism. And this is what the socialists and the communists who call themselves socialist workers can't even understand. Note the title of the USSR. It's the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Marx preached socialism, which is the same as communism. The only technical difference between communism and socialism is that socialism is via the ballot box. So, in 1945, the hobbits, who Elon Musk has described as, I might come on to the hobbits another time. So the hobbits had a choice between capitalism and communism. Now, to be fair, these guys, if it wasn't for the USSR, we could be speaking German. Essentially, if you read Mein Kampf, Hitler was saying that all kinds of stuff about communism, and just being anti-communism does not make you a capitalist. He was a fascist. Sound familiar? So we had this great election, and this election was a disaster because essentially we had one of those nasty events in history. We had a Labour government. Now, the one in the 30s ended up in a national government. And I actually think Starmer needs to do the right thing now. He needs to form a group of MPs who know what needs to be done, which is probably about 100 MPs. He needs to cross the floor, join with Kebby Badenoch in a national government. History repeats itself. Mark my words. So, we had the so-called Great Labour government. And this is where you won't like this. So they nationalised the railways. So if you're paying higher rail fares caused by unionisation, then blame the Labour government of 1945. They nationalised the railways. They nationalised coal. So if you can remember the lights going out as a child, which I can, thank this 1945 Labour government. They also nationalised steel and they nationalised cars. Can you please name me some British cars? Now, meanwhile, over in Germany, this video is off the cuff. It's from up here. So if there's any Ofsted inspectors working, that Kiwis know what that means. So in Germany, they had a head of their central bank was a cigar propping free marketeer. They were told by the British to introduce price controls, so they abolished them. And West Germany was the star economic performer of the post-war period. Just read your economic history. So they kept the VW, BASF. Germany was the industrial powerhouse, and thank God Germany became a peaceful nation back in the family of nations. And also you had France, which also decided to go down a period of supply-side reforms. So, but over in UK, as we suddenly decided to rebrand ourselves because we realized we were no longer a great power, so we rebranded ourselves UK to sit next to the Americans. But our government was a total hellhole. And the other thing which the Labour government claimed, which they think was a good idea, was the National Horror Show. Now, for any centrists watching this is a problem. Because the railways created, I mean, who's the Jimmy Knapp? You created Jimmy Knapp, you created people who essentially every 6 months hold the City of London to ransom. This lady would have sorted you out. Unfortunately, the traitors in her party got rid of her. The coal industry was nationalised. When you nationalise an industry, you basically create union power. And you create even more union power. Then you had nationalisation of the steel industry. So essentially, Britain did a leapfrog. We went, whew. I mean, we may as well have applied to the USSR and say, can we become another Soviet, please? We literally became a communist nutjob. And then what happened was there was a financial crisis because of this Labour government. It didn't last long. It was a disaster. But then you had Churchill back. So Britain went to being a socialist basket case. The Americans in the 70s were calling us Socialist Britain. We still are. And then we had our greatest ever Prime Minister. Sound familiar? If we go back to the 1970s, you know, things were a bit more sexist at that time. Just go and ask Nigel Farage. People said, oh my word, they've got a woman. How can you possibly have that? So this lady was nicknamed the Iron Lady. Fantastic. She was the Iron Lady. She was the saviour of Britain. She made mistakes. Now, by the time she got into power, in 1978 to 9, you had strikes. Sound familiar? This is what the socialists did to the last weak Conservative government. We had doctors' strikes, we had rail strikes, and Rachel Reeves paid them all off in the 2024 budget. So we had inflation at around 10%. We had unemployment over 1 million. We had a car industry that produced rubbish like the Mini. Now people say, oh, the Mini, it's really great, it's blah, blah, blah. If you've ever had an old Mini, you realised you were just buying a rust bucket on wheels. So the country was in huge trouble. And then we had a prime minister who turned it around. She had high public debt. She had to control government spending. And she also had the Keynesian orthodoxy. Now, I actually personally believe that Keynes did have a bit of a point. There was the famous case of Richard Nixon when he said, well, you know, we're all Keynesians now. Keynesians essentially say that this system is good, but what you've got to do is to introduce government to spend money in bad times, but also to build up a surplus in good times. Now, the trouble is that this guy did not work. We tried that in many countries from 1945 till about 1972. The problem when you've let a genie like Keynes, who basically recycled Malthusian theory, the economist Malthus, is that it's very easy for the government to overspend during a recession. It's not so easy for a government to run a surplus in good times. And if you look at the economic history of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, you will see that the last time that we had a surplus was, I think, under Blair. But let's look at the stealth and the deception of Blair. So, under Mrs. Thatcher, this became a thing of the past. She tackled the unions, she tackled the leftists, but she failed in two areas. I'll come back to that because, and I'm just going to write a note to myself for any Ofsted inspectors, is she still had the unions, she had the teachers, and she had local government. And I'm now quoting her book. So, Britain moved to the USA. We allowed internal investment from Nissan, and as industrial policy, Mrs. Thatcher decided she tried to save Leyland. Read her book. But then this guy had come in, Ronald Reagan. Now, he was the guy who essentially defeated the USSR, although more so he was the figurehead. Now, Reagan was okay apart from one problem. He introduced Reaganomics, and he's not got a second poster. So he introduced Reaganomics. Now, as the name suggests, problem. Sorry, Ronnie, but you might be joining Kia in a minute. Good. Log off. Kia. Right, anyway, Reaganomics. Reaganomics was okay, but the problem Reagan had is he had Democrats, or demo rats. Basically, the Democratic Party is like cancer for your economy. Now, that is a metaphor, by the way. That is a metaphor. They are the cancer of an economy. Because what they really are is they are socialists in disguise. And Reagan had to deal with a Democrat-controlled Congress. And unfortunately, she actually lambasted him for doing this. The problem with Reagan is he let this genie out of the bottle. Is he ran a deficit, leading to national debt. Now, I don't have time to explain the difference, but I can tell you most people can't tell the difference between the deficit and the debt. Although if you're reading the situation with Thatcher at the moment, with Rachel Reeves at the moment, is that she's saying, I want to cut the deficit by raising taxes. That's a good idea. Now, she's actually technically correct because she's just a wishy-washy Keynesian, basically. She thinks she can tax her way out of problems. Labour government always leave the public finances worse off than they are. But Reagan essentially kept running a deficit, and this lady didn't have the clout to try and stop Reagan doing this. She was the junior partner in the dynamic duo who busted wokeism, but she didn't actually. So, what then happened was that if you reduce government spending, you are going to cause short-term pain. So the teachers were up in arms, you had local government up in arms, and the unions she pretty much destroyed, apart from a couple. But she took Britain back to growth, and then debt to GDP, it was nearer 90%. She took it to about 35%. You can look up the figures and fact check this video. So the way she did that was partly through the privatization program. She reversed the program of the Labour government, and her slogan was roll back the frontiers of the state. It's exactly what it means. It meant lessening the role of the government in the economy, lower taxes, but lower government spending. She faced economic turmoil. She saw unemployment rise. She had 364 economists write to her and tell her what she was doing was wrong. And she was right. Patrick Mumford was correct. But then came the 1983 and the 1987 elections. The 1983 election was a total rejection of the Labour Party. And what was a real shame was that the Conservative Party at the time were running commercials saying, if you vote for the SDP Liberal Alliance, then you're voting for Labour, which of course you were. The great shame of that election was that Lord Owen and Shirley Williams did not actually totally destroy the Labour Party, because the Labour Party is the great Satan of the British economy, which I'm going to come to next, and why we're in so much trouble now. We're in huge trouble now. Because she took Britain back to where it should be, but she made several mistakes. One is, I think she should have had a tactical industrial policy like the Germans did after the Second World War. She should have done more to encourage British business free of union interference, and she is responsible for the inward investment of Nissan. So the reason why Sunderland is a much better place now is because of the inward investment of Nissan, yada, 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 yada. So, but then she was stabbed in the back. She was never voted out of office. She had her treacherous MPs. And the biggest traitor, and he's still alive, was called Heseltine. Heseltine couldn't even run a helicopter company. He started making a big fuss about a helicopter company, and then in the late 80s, the other big mistake she made was allowing Lawson to introduce too much growth into the economy. In other words, he should have reduced taxes in a shock budget. What year was his famous budget was 87, and it introduced the Lawson boom. Again, Keynesians would be saying, well, but the problem with the boom was then it inflated the property market went down, and then Britain went through a very long recession. Now, we then had the traitor Major. And why we have the problem with the EU, why we left. Major basically compromised with the Europeans. This lady said, no, no, no. What the Europeans and the socialists in the EU wanted to do was to reintroduce the regulations which had led to this. What they wanted to do was to say, oh, we need net zero. Oh, we need to have a regulation for this. Oh, and by the way, let's have labour rights, increasing the power of unions so we can have inefficient businesses. So what they wanted to do was to undo her good work by the back door. Now, Major was conned by the EU. To a certain extent, she was conned by the Single European Act, but she did actually warn, when she accepted free movement, she warned the Europeans about the chaos that would ensue if we had the immigration system that Europe has, which we allow people from North Africa and the Middle East to just roam around Europe, and they're now coming over on small boats. But she was pro-immigration, but she wasn't pro the asylum system as it is. So Major came along. John Major. Now, John Major made two key mistakes. The first thing he started to do was he started to run a budget deficit to try and pull Britain out of what was quite a painful recession. And the other thing was he was responsible for the creation of the EU. He had veto. Now, had she been in power, she would have vetoed Maastricht. Now, Major thought he'd come out okay because he kept the pound, and he also didn't join the Schengen, which is the, completely free movement. Yeah. So he retained border controls, and he also kept the pound sterling, which then became it almost became a slave currency to the euro. And so essentially Major created Brexit, even though he says, oh, I'm anti-Brexit, blah, blah, blah. And so Major pulled the economy out. But people forget that this lady saw a long-term view for the economy. Now, the problem for Britain then is we allowed the communists to stay in the teaching profession. They stayed in the local government, and they stayed in the unions. Now, their first attempt was Kinnock. Now, Kinnock was a pillock. He tried to get Labour back in 87, and Maggie Thatcher slapped him down because the British public accepted this. That's why now the electorate is divided, and it's also divided on demographic because the baby boomers remember all this. I'm actually too young to remember all this, but I was basically brought up where my wanker of an elder brother was trying to indoctrinate everybody with communism. That's why when I went to university, it was all a bit of a I realised what was going on. But she let these people stay, local government, unions. And the problem was Ofsted in local government. They were overspending via the rates. That's why she tried the poll tax. I actually think the poll tax was a mistake. I think what she should have done was to introduce local income tax. But she let these two, and like I say, it's like socialism is like a disease. And then the Labour Party went through. Then we had the great Satan himself, Blair. Now, Blair's 1997 deception. I've already said John Major was a traitor. He was just basically enabled by Major. And he could see this working. But he did. He was a destroyer. And he was the man, Curian candidate. I think possibly paid for by China, I'm not sure. There is something so bad about Blair, you don't want to know. So, on day one, introduce price controls. Now, you Ofsted idiots are going to go, oh, yeah, it's only